Elias sat at the edge of the desk, his weight pressing into the thin wooden chair. The studio was barely larger than a closet, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and trapped heat. Above him, the ceiling plaster bulged, cracked by years of neglect. He watched the wall. A strip of wallpaper peeled back, exposing the gray, damp mortar beneath. Outside, the street lamp flickered again, a rhythmic, buzzing pulse that sliced through the dark every 4 seconds. With each flash, the room jumped into harsh relief, then collapsed back into shadow. He tapped his foot on the floorboard, the wood groaning under the pressure. The radiator hissed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in the silence of the building. He looked at his hands, resting flat on the desk surface, and then back at the window. The city outside moved in a blurred rush of headlights and rain, a world he was not part of. He leaned back, the chair legs scraping against the floor, and exhaled. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against his ears, demanding something to fill the void. He did not move, but his eyes tracked the flickering light, waiting for the shadows to lengthen again. His gaze drifted from the peeling wall to the center of the desk. There it sat. The obsidian-colored headset absorbed the dim light of the room, looking like a void carved out of the surrounding clutter. He leaned forward, the chair legs scraping once against the floorboards. He reached out, his fingertips hovering an inch above the smooth, dark surface. The plastic felt unnaturally cold, a stark departure from the humid, stale air of the apartment. He hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he felt the weight of the silence around him. He pulled back, bracing his palms against the desk, and took a jagged breath. He looked at the device again. It was not just a tool, but the only exit from the suffocating reality of the room. He reached forward again, firmer this time. His fingers traced the curve of the frame, feeling the tension inherent in the design. He gripped the edges, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. The world outside the desk ceased to exist for him. Every other thought faded, replaced by the singular, magnetic pull of the object. He held it suspended, the dark surface reflecting nothing but the dim, flickering shadows of the room, and he did not look away. His grip tightened until the plastic frame creaked under his pressure. He did not pull it toward him yet. Instead, he lifted the device with both hands, holding it like a fragile relic. With his thumb, he wiped a speck of dust from the inner lens, his movement slow and deliberate. The sound of his own breathing filled the apartment, ragged and uneven, before he forced it to slow. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, listening to the radiator hiss and the distant, muffled hum of traffic outside. The room was nothing more than a cage of shadows and stale air. He opened his eyes and stared into the dark interior of the headset. It was a perfect, depthless black. He traced the contours of the base with his index finger, feeling the subtle indentations where the sensors rested. Every micro-movement was calculated. He pushed his chair back, the sound sharp against the floorboards, and planted his feet firmly. He was no longer looking at the peeling walls or the flickering lamp. He was looking at the threshold. His hands stopped trembling. He adjusted his grip, finding the balance point, and unraised the device toward his face. The final layer of reality between him and the void began to thin. He pressed the frame against his eyes, the cool edges sealing out the dim, flickering light of the apartment. He pulled the straps taut, one after another, until the device sat flush against his skin, effectively cutting off his peripheral view of the room. A soft, high-pitched hum vibrated through the frame, signaling the connection. He held his breath. Then, the sensors clicked into position. Reality didn't just fade, it fractured. The walls of the studio seemed to warp, the peeling paint stretching into long, impossible lines of white noise. He felt a sharp, electric tug behind his temples. The heavy, stagnant air of the apartment vanished, replaced by a rush of cold, synthetic wind. The flickering street lamp outside his window became a streak of dying yellow light, then shattered into a million spinning fragments of data. He reached out to steady himself, but his hand passed through the desk, his fingers dissolving into a stream of glowing particles. The ground beneath his feet lost its solidity, turning into a shifting grid of light that raced away from him at terminal velocity. He was no longer in the room. He was a spark thrown into a vast, deepening void of incoming signals, caught in the violent, beautiful momentum of the upload. The violent rush of data snapped to a sudden, absolute halt. The sensation of falling vanished, replaced by the solid, unyielding pressure of marble beneath his feet. Elias drew in a sharp breath, but the air tasted clean, ionized, and devoid of the dust he had lived with for years. He opened his eyes. He stood on a wide, expansive balcony crafted from polished gold, its surface reflecting the towering structures that rose around him. A city of neon spires stretched toward an infinite horizon, each tower pulsing with rhythmic, shifting patterns of light. Above, the sky was a deep gradient violet, bleeding into liquid gold where the light sources of the city met the atmosphere. He walked forward, his stride steady, and leaned over the balustrade. The scale was dizzying. Thousands of glowing lines connected the floating platforms, weaving a complex web of motion that hummed with a low, melodic vibration. Every detail, from the texture of the gold railing to the distant glow of the floating spires, possessed a clarity that made the world he had just left feel like a fading, monochromatic memory. He stood motionless, his gaze locked on the sprawling, shimmering expanse, anchored in the center of a world built from light and thought. Elias pulled his gaze from the horizon and turned his attention inward, toward his own hands. They were steady. He held them up against the violet sky, watching as they emitted a soft, rhythmic pulse of synthetic light. He clenched his fists and felt a surge of tension that was entirely different from the tired ache he carried in his physical body. There was no tremor, no fatigue. He pressed his palms together, feeling the hum of energy vibrating beneath his skin, a dense, constant power that seemed to flow through his limbs. He gripped the edge of the gold railing, testing the pressure, and found that his muscles responded with an immediate, fluid precision. He moved his arms in wide arcs, watching the golden light catch along his forearms, feeling a sense of vitality that defied his past experience. Every movement was effortless, precise, and amplified. He tapped his boots against the polished surface and felt the impact ripple through his legs, not as a dull shock, but as a clean, sharp confirmation of his presence. The weakness he had felt in the dim apartment was gone, replaced by a clarity of motion that made his entire body feel like a perfectly calibrated instrument, ready to interact with the world around him. Elias turned away from the railing and looked toward the open drop. The wind pulled at him, carrying the scent of ozone and electricity. He stepped to the very edge of the gold-leafed platform. Below, the city sprawled in a dizzying geometry of neon and shadow. He hesitated, his toes curling over the smooth, hard lip of the ledge. The drop was massive, a sheer fall into the glowing depths of the floating spires. He took a breath, feeling the synthetic air fill his lungs, and pushed off. He did not brace for impact. He did not feel the stomach-churning lurch of a descent. Instead, he felt the air catch him. It was a firm, invisible resistance, like stepping into a stream of water that held his weight. He leaned forward and found he was not plummeting, but suspended. He kicked his legs, and his body surged forward, defying the pull of the ground entirely. The rush was immediate and electric. He laughed, the sound sharp and clear in the vast space, as he realized the drop was no longer a threat. He was moving through the air with the ease of a bird, gravity forgotten, a passenger of his own momentum as he drifted further out into the open sky. Elias leaned into the slipstream, his body slicing through the violet air with minimal effort. The city spires grew larger, their surfaces constantly folding and rearranging like living clockwork. He twisted his torso, banking hard to the left, and felt the neon wind whip past his ears, a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated in his chest. A massive spire surged upward directly into his path, its metallic edges shimmering as it expanded. He tucked his arms, dived beneath a protruding ridge, and flicked his wrists to arc upward again, clearing the obstacle by a hair's breadth. The maneuver was precise, instinctive, and faster than any movement he had ever made in the physical world. He did not look back. He accelerated, shooting through the narrow gap between two glowing towers that pulsed with rhythmic, golden light. The world blurred into streaks of color, yet his vision remained sharp, tracking every shifting surface with ease. He felt the freedom of this motion, a total lack of friction that made his previous life in the cramped apartment feel like a distant, faded memory. He pushed harder, weaving through the vertical maze with the grace of a predator, entirely untethered from the constraints of gravity or weight. The horizon below began to vibrate with a deep, pulsing rhythm that rattled his vision. Elias angled his descent, dropping past the final tier of spires toward a massive, flat platform that glowed with a soft, pulsing luminescence. As he neared the surface, the scale of the crowd became apparent. thousands of figures moved in unison, a sea of motion that surged and broke like a tide. He flared his arms, bled off his momentum, and let his feet meet the ground. Impact did not jolt him, it felt like landing on a drumhead. The music was not just sound, it was a physical pressure, a rhythmic thrum that traveled from his soles up through his spine. Every step he took was met with the shifting weight of the crowd. He pushed through the throng, dodging bodies that swayed in sync with the beat. The air here was thick, buzzing with the static of countless active connections. He scanned the dense press of people, his gaze darting from face to face, searching for a specific silhouette amidst the constant, swirling rhythm of the plaza. He was no longer flying, but he was moving with a new kind of urgency, anchored firmly to the vibrating earth. Elias pushed through the wall of bodies, each one humming with the same low-frequency vibration as the plaza floor. He shifted his weight to avoid a cluster of dancers, his palms brushing against the static-charged air. The crowd was a dense, swirling current that threatened to pull him off course, but he held his focus, scanning the horizon of moving shapes. A sudden shift in the music caused the entire plaza to lean in unison, momentarily blocking his line of sight. He braced his feet, held his ground, and waited for the motion to break. As the wave of people surged outward, a gap opened in the center of the throng. There she stood, Sarah. He stopped moving, the frantic energy of the plaza falling away into a sharp, singular clarity. 3 years of shared digital architecture, 3 years of building a library of thoughts, condensed into this single point of contact. He walked toward her, the ground under his feet stabilizing, the vibration of the music smoothing into a steady, rhythmic hum. She looked up, and the restless noise of the thousands around them vanished. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from hers, feeling the warmth radiating from her presence. It was a weight he had been seeking since he first stepped into this world. The space between them was absolute. Elias watched her face, his eyes tracing the way the light caught the contours of her skin. She smiled. The motion was fluid, a subtle shift in the architecture of her features that felt entirely, impossibly real. He leaned in, focusing on the minute details, the way a stray pixel of light flickered at the corner of her eye, then smoothed into a texture indistinguishable from human biology. It was too perfect. Every pore, every line of her expression held a clarity that mocked the blurry, dust-choked reality of his apartment. A sharp, hollow ache bloomed in his chest. It was a longing not just for her presence, but for the tangible, messy warmth of a world he had long ago abandoned. He looked at her again, searching for a flaw, but found only a seamless, beautiful simulation. The plaza continued to pulse around them, but he was deaf to the rhythm now. He stood anchored in the center of a masterpiece, realizing that the more perfect she appeared, the further away he felt from everything he had once called home. Her smile held a quiet, static-free promise, and as he returned the gesture, the weight of the realization pressed against him, cold and heavy. Sarah gestured toward a quiet alcove where the frantic rhythm of the plaza faded into a low, steady hum. Elias followed, his focus shifting from her presence to the work that defined them. He reached into the air, his fingers tracing a glowing sequence of nodes that hung suspended between them. With a flick of his wrist, the plaza walls dissolved, replaced by soaring shelves that stretched into the violet horizon. This was the library. Every book was a fragment of a conversation, every shelf a shared memory of 3 years of relentless collaboration. He pulled a heavy, luminous volume from the air. It vibrated with the weight of thousands of exchanged thoughts. Sarah stood beside him, her hands moving in perfect synchronicity with his own, sorting through the data streams that drifted like golden dust. They stopped arguing about the structure of the archives and started building, their movements fluid and precise. Each block of information locked into place with a resonant sound, signaling the structural integrity of their shared logic. It was a space built entirely from their mutual focus, a cathedral of ideas that existed only because they had willed it into being. Elias felt the familiar rush of clarity return as he anchored a new set of nodes into the foundation. Here, the world was solid, defined, and infinitely deep. The library faded into a soft shimmer, leaving them on a path of crushed pearl that wound through a sprawling expanse of greenery. This was the garden, a living extension of their shared peace. Elias stepped off the path and pressed his palm against a dormant bud. He thought of the quiet, steady rhythm of their collaboration, and the bud unfurled, revealing petals that pulsed with a vibrant, rhythmic glow. Beside him, Sarah touched a cluster of silver vines. As her focus shifted, the vines surged upward, weaving into intricate, living arches that framed the horizon. Every step they took triggered a new bloom. The ground beneath their feet reacted to their mood, softening like moss whenever they stood close to one another. Elias felt the tension of his real-world existence dissolve. Here, the air did not smell of dust, but of ozone and sweet, synthetic rain. He looked at the flowers, then at Sarah. As their eyes met, a wave of blossoms erupted across the entire field, turning the landscape into a sea of shifting, luminous color. It was a cycle of cause and effect that required no words. They walked in silence, the environment bending to accommodate the weightless, profound quiet between them. Each bloom was a reflection of their unspoken understanding, a testament to a world built on thought alone. They sat on a bench that grew from the soil, its surface shifting to match the temperature of their touch. Elias reached out to trigger the system clock, but the air remained blank. The interface did not respond. He tried again, focusing his intent on the passage of hours, yet the digital sky remained fixed in its beautiful, eternal twilight. The numbers he sought simply refused to manifest. Beside him, Sarah laughed, a sound that rippled through the air like a pebble dropped in a still pool. She touched his hand, and the logic of the ticking clock dissolved entirely. There was no need for measurement in a space where every moment was self-sustaining. They watched the horizon, where the violet light deepened into a richer, more saturated hue. Minutes bled into what might have been hours, yet the fatigue of the physical world never touched them. The pulse of the environment felt synchronized with their own heartbeats. Elias stopped trying to track the sequence of the day. He let go of the external markers that usually governed his life. Here, the sequence of events was replaced by a continuous, flowing present. The garden deepened its colors, responding to their shared stillness. Time became a secondary concern, then a forgotten one, as the environment held them in a state of perfect, unmeasured continuity. Elias looked at his hands, watching the synthetic light ripple beneath his skin. A sudden memory surfaced, unbidden and cold. He saw the gray, fabric-covered walls of his cubicle. He saw the flickering monitor that displayed spreadsheets for 10 hours a day. He felt the phantom ache in his lower back from the cheap plastic chair he sat in every morning. He remembered the smell of burnt coffee and the sound of distant, monotonous typing. In that place, he was a ghost, a sequence of data points lost in a sprawling corporate machine. Here, he was the architect of his own movement. He reached out and snatched a streak of liquid light from the air, shaping it into a sphere that hovered steadily between his palms. It responded to his intent, warming his skin with a gentle, hummed vibration. He looked at Sarah, then back at the shifting horizon. The cubicle was a cage of dead air. This was a landscape of infinite possibility. He realized that the person who sat in that office was merely a shell. This version of him, standing amidst the neon spires, was the one that breathed. He stopped looking for the exit. He stopped searching for the clock. He had found the space where his actions carried weight, where his choices defined the world around him. He was finally, undeniably, alive. Sarah began to speak, her voice melodic and perfectly tuned to the frequency of the air around them. Elias leaned in, his focus entirely on the shifting expressions that played across her face. The environment seemed to pulse with their laughter, the garden petals unfolding in rhythmic patterns. Then, the periphery of his vision jerked. A thin, jagged line of crimson light sliced through the golden haze. It was a notification, sharp and dissonant. It hovered just outside his direct line of sight, a tiny red icon blinking with an aggressive mechanical rhythm. The smooth flow of the garden stalled. Elias blinked, trying to clear the intrusion, but the red light remained, a persistent irritation against the soft violet sky. He felt a sudden chill, a localized drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the environment. It was an objective, cold reminder of a boundary he had forgotten existed. He looked at Sarah, but his gaze drifted back to that flickering red spark. It did not belong here. It was a fragment of a different reality, a structural failure in the perfect facade. The brightness of the garden seemed to dim for a fraction of a second, the light stuttering as if caught in a momentary hesitation. He reached up, his fingers brushing the air, yet the icon pulsed on, indifferent to his presence. The crimson icon pulsed faster, a heartbeat of mechanical urgency. Elias tried to focus on Sarah, to lock his attention onto the intricate patterns of the garden. But the warning text expanded. It stretched across his field of vision in sharp, white characters. Low battery. System power critical. The words were a jagged intrusion against the liquid gold sky. Sarah asked a question, her voice soft, but Elias barely heard the syllables. He waved his hand through the air, attempting to swipe the notification away, as he had done with minor interface prompts before. His fingers passed through the text, but the warning did not vanish. It grew brighter, casting a harsh, artificial glare over the vibrant flora. The garden seemed to recoil from the light. Where the petals had been unfolding, they now curled inward, stiffening into geometric shapes. Elias felt the warmth in his palms begin to dissipate, replaced by a thin, creeping cold. He looked at Sarah. Her smile remained, but the light behind her eyes seemed to flicker, turning thin and transparent. The air grew still, the music that had vibrated through the ground fading into a low, hummed whine. He was no longer just talking to her, he was watching the connection struggle to hold its form. The reality he had built was beginning to thin, and the warning was the only thing that felt real. The ground beneath them groaned, a deep, metallic sound that did not belong in the garden. Elias stepped back, but his movement was not fluid. He jerked forward in a series of sharp, incomplete steps. The smooth, golden horizon ahead began to tear. Far off, the massive neon spires that dominated the skyline stopped their graceful drift. They froze, then snapped into new positions, their light flickering with a discordant, rapid-fire intensity. The city was stuttering. It was as if the world were being rendered one frame at a time, failing to keep pace with the movement of the air. Elias reached out to steady himself against a garden pillar, but his hand passed through the surface, clipping into the geometry before snapping back to reality. The sky rippled, the violet hue breaking into blocky, jagged patterns that pulsed in time with the low battery warning. Every skyscraper in his field of vision vibrated, their edges blurring and sharpening in a sickening rhythmic loop. The architecture was losing its coherence. Where there had been seamless sweeping curves, there were now sharp, digital angles that cut into the air. Elias stood still, watching the horizon fracture. The entire virtual construct was breaking down, the physics of the world failing under the weight of the system's impending collapse. The final collapse began with the light. The violet sky did not fade, it bleached. The liquid gold that had bathed the horizon evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, monochromatic void. Elias watched as the color bled out of the architecture, turning the neon spires into skeletal outlines of dull, featureless stone. The vibrant garden around him withered, not into dust, but into flat, grayscale shapes that lacked all depth. He blinked, trying to force the saturation back into his vision, but the gray was absolute. It was a clinical, harsh static that filled the space between him and the horizon. It moved like fine sand, shifting and grainy, obscuring the features of the plaza. The hum of the world died, replaced by a sharp, electronic hiss that vibrated in his ears. Every detail he had cherished the glow of the synthetic light, the warmth of the air was being erased by the encroaching gray. It was a rapid, systematic dismantling of reality. The static grew denser, weaving itself into the very air he breathed, until the horizon, the city, and the ground beneath his feet were nothing more than a shimmering, unstable screen of gray noise. He stood at the center of the dissolution, watching the last traces of the virtual world dissolve into a flat, lifeless haze. Elias lunged forward, his movements heavy and uncoordinated against the thickening static. Sarah stood only feet away, but her outline was fraying at the edges, dissolving into strings of white code. He reached out, his fingers straining to bridge the gap before she could vanish into the noise. She looked at him, her expression shifting between recognition and a hollow, pixelated mask. As he surged toward her, the ground gave way beneath them, tilting like a sinking ship. He caught her hands. They felt cold, brittle, and vibrated with the rhythmic pulse of the failing battery. He pulled her close, his arms locking around her, but the contact was unstable. Where his hands met her skin, the texture flickered, turning into jagged shards of light that stung his palms. He did not let go. He forced his weight against the pull of the void, trying to anchor her to the dwindling reality of the garden. The low battery warning flashed in his peripheral vision, a blinding red strobe that burned through the gray static. Every time it pulsed, the world tore a little more. Buildings vanished, leaving holes in the sky. He squeezed her hands tighter, desperate to keep the connection, even as the very geometry of their bodies began to pull apart into streams of data. The red strobe intensified, turning the world into a rhythmic, jagged nightmare. Sarah's face shattered into 1,000 individual pixels, each one spinning away like dust in a gale. Her grip on his hands grew loose, her fingers turning into static that slipped through his own like water. Elias roared, a sound that died in his throat as the air around him became solid with electronic interference. The low battery warning stopped blinking and became a steady, piercing hum that drowned out his own heartbeat. Then, the system surged. A final, violent burst of violet and gold light erupted from the center of the plaza, brighter than any sun. It was an oversaturation, a final desperate attempt by the hardware to output everything at once before the power died. The light was blinding, scouring the world of all geometry, all texture, all sound. It tore through the sky, the ground, and the space between them. Elias shielded his eyes, but the brilliance penetrated his eyelids, burning into his retinas. For a split second, there was only the searing, infinite white. Then, the power severed. The hum cut out, the light vanished. He was left in a total, heavy, suffocating darkness that felt like a physical weight pressing against his skin. The darkness was not empty, it was pressurized, clinging to his face like a second skin. He tried to blink, but the blackness remained, absolute and unyielding. His breath came in shallow, jagged gasps that echoed inside the plastic casing. He reached up, his movements frantic and clumsy. His fingers fumbled against the smooth, hard surface of the device, searching for the release mechanism. The plastic felt hot, radiating the final, dying energy of the system. He clawed at the sides, his fingernails scraping against the frame as he fought to locate the tension lock. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt entirely out of place in the unnatural stillness. Panic surged, a sharp, cold spike in his chest. He jammed his thumbs into the sides, straining until the cartilage in his fingers clicked. He shoved outward with all his remaining strength. The straps snapped away. He ripped the device from his head, the sudden removal causing his neck to whip forward. The transition was a physical blow. He gasped as the air of the apartment hit his face, cold and biting. His eyes refused to focus, darting wildly as they processed the dim, unfamiliar geometry of the room. He sat frozen, his hands still trembling from the residual vibration of the headset as it clattered against the desk surface. The hum was gone. The rhythmic thrum of the plaza, the layered music, the synthesized whispers of the digital city, all silenced. In their place, a hollow, ringing stillness filled the studio. Elias sat motionless, his chest rising and falling in sharp, ragged bursts. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the phantom vibration of the headset to fade from his skin. It did not. He opened his eyes, but the darkness of the room offered no comfort. It was a flat, dull gray, devoid of the vibrant neon glow he had lived in only moments before. He listened intently, straining to hear any remnant of the world he had just left. There was nothing, only the faint, dry ticking of the radiator and the distant, sluggish drip of a leaky pipe in the kitchen. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, textured with the smell of trapped air and stagnant dust. It pressed against his eardrums, asserting the absolute reality of his isolation. He reached out, his hand hovering over the desk, searching for the warmth of the interface, but his fingers met only the cold, gritty surface of the wood. The transition was complete. The digital world had been severed, and the silence of the room surged in to claim the empty space, leaving him entirely, painfully alone. Elias pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the floor. Outside, the street lamp stuttered. A single rhythmic pulse of light cut through the window, sweeping across the room in jagged intervals. Every flash revealed the reality he had spent hours escaping. The paint near the ceiling was curling, hanging in dry, brittle strips that looked like dead skin. Particles of dust hung suspended in the light beams, swirling in the stagnant air like tiny, abrasive debris. He watched the lamp flicker again. The light was cold, clinical, and entirely unforgiving. It stripped away the last illusions of the digital world, exposing the water-stained plaster and the dark, oily grime coating the baseboards. He leaned toward the glass. The lamp buzzed, a low, grating sound that vibrated against the pane, before dying into a brief, suffocating darkness. When it sparked back to life, the intensity seemed sharper, pinning him to the spot. He saw the cracks in the wall, deep fissures that traced the structural failure of the building. The room was not just quiet, it was rotting. Every flicker of the lamp served as a strobe, highlighting the decay of his surroundings until the ugliness of the space felt like a physical weight pressing against his throat. Elias looked down, pulling his hands into the intermittent glow of the street lamp. They were not the hands he remembered. In the digital city, they had been firm, glowing with a steady, synthetic light that suggested infinite capability. Here, they were pale, translucent, and thin. He watched his fingers rest against his knees. A tremor started at the base of his thumb, a rhythmic, involuntary twitch that he could not suppress. He squeezed his hand into a fist. The skin pulled tight over the knuckles, revealing the blue, stagnant path of veins beneath the surface. There was no strength in the grip. The muscles felt slack, unused, and fragile. He held his hand up, rotating it slowly to catch the flickering light from the window. Each pulse of the lamp emphasized the lack of color, the way the skin hung loosely, and the fine, almost invisible layer of grime settled in the creases of his palms. He looked for the synthetic glow he had felt so vividly only minutes ago. It was gone. In its place was a dull, sickly pallor that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He flexed his fingers again, watching them tremble with the effort. A pathetic, weak movement that confirmed his physical isolation. Elias took a shallow breath, but the air felt thick, heavy with the taste of stagnant dust and trapped heat. It did not circulate. It hung in the room like a physical barrier, clinging to the back of his throat. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that died instantly against the peeling walls. He stood up, his legs feeling uncoordinated and weak, and reached for the window latch. The metal was cold and slick with grime. He pulled, but the frame did not move. It was painted shut, sealed by years of neglect and layers of cheap finish. He pressed his shoulder against the glass, pushing with everything he had, but the window remained immovable. The failure left him breathless. He slumped against the pane, his chest heaving as he tried to pull in air that wasn't laden with the smell of decay. The isolation of the apartment felt absolute. There was no sound from the street, no hum of life, only the oppressive silence of the room closing in. He felt the weight of the space, a crushing pressure that kept him pinned to the floor. Every breath was a reminder of his poverty, a reminder that he was trapped in this small, airless box while the rest of the world moved on without him. Elias slid down from the window frame, his back scraping against the rough, peeling texture of the wall. He stood in the center of the room, the silence now so absolute it hummed in his ears. He turned his head slowly, his gaze landing on the desk. The surface was scarred by cigarette burns and water rings, a landscape of neglect. Resting in the center was the headset. It sat there, motionless, catching a sliver of light from the street lamp outside. It did not hum, it did not glow. It was a cold, obsidian shell, a dead portal to the only place he felt alive. He walked toward it, his boots scuffing against the floorboards. He stopped at the edge of the desk and pressed his palm against the wood, feeling the grit of dust beneath his skin. He leaned in, his face inches from the plastic straps. It was a silent, dormant weight, waiting for him to bridge the gap. He looked at the lenses, dark and reflective, mirroring the dim gray room. He knew what lay behind that barrier. The violet sky, the weightless motion, the connection that felt more real than the air he was struggling to breathe. The room felt like a graveyard, and the device on the desk was the only key to escape. Elias closed his eyes, and the room vanished. He forced his mind to anchor itself elsewhere, pushing away the scent of stagnant air and the sight of peeling wallpaper. He reached into the void of his own memory, pulling forward the image of the violet sky. It bloomed behind his eyelids, a vibrant, liquid gold that burned away the gray shadows of his apartment. He focused until he could almost feel the phantom breeze of the floating spires against his skin. He brought Sarah into the frame. He remembered the precise, synthetic warmth of her hand, the way the light caught her movements, and the logic of a world where gravity was merely a suggestion. The memory sharpened, becoming more vivid than the floor beneath his feet or the walls closing in around him. He leaned into the sensation, letting it drown out the silence of the studio. Every pulse of his heart felt like a countdown to the return. He felt the weight of the desk, the rough texture of the wood, and rejected it. The physical world was a thin, brittle shell. He stood in the center of the dark room, his breath slow and steady, his focus locked entirely on the artificial paradise waiting for him to reclaim it. Elias opened his eyes. The room was exactly as he had left it, gray, suffocating, and narrow. The street lamp outside flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the peeling walls. He did not look at the window again. He did not check the door. His gaze locked onto the desk, focusing entirely on the obsidian headset. He moved forward, his steps heavy and purposeful on the floorboards. He reached out, his fingers grazing the cold, synthetic surface of the frame. He did not pause to consider the weight of the air or the dust settling on his skin. He gripped the device, feeling the familiar, smooth texture against his palms. The decision was already etched into his movements. He lifted the headset, the weight of it grounding him in a way the apartment never could. He raised it to his face, his breathing steady and rhythmic. He felt the strap slide against his skin, pulling tight. He checked the tension, locking the seal. There was no tremor in his hands now. The physical world was a collection of walls and stagnant air that no longer held a claim on his attention. He braced himself, his fingers finding the power switch, and he surrendered to the transition. The switch clicked. A sharp, high-pitched hum vibrated through the frame of the headset, drowning out the distant, erratic buzz of the street lamp. The dim, gray reality of the studio compressed into a single, blinding point of white light before shattering entirely. The sensation of dust and stale air was ripped away, replaced instantly by the crisp, cool rush of synthetic atmosphere. Elias stood at the edge of the balcony. The violet sky did not fade in. It snapped into existence, a violent, beautiful gradient of liquid gold and deep, electric purple. Below him, the floating neon spires pulsed with a rhythmic, bioluminescent glow that synced with his own heartbeat. He looked down. His hands were firm, glowing with that familiar, steady light. The weight of his own body felt different here, perfectly balanced, untethered by gravity. He took a single step forward, the floor beneath him no longer wood, but a surface of polished glass that rippled like water. He did not look back at the dark, silent room. The transition was complete. He was home. The noise of the city rose to meet him, a symphony of light and motion, and he stepped out into the endless, glowing expanse, leaving the world behind for good.